Good morning, everybody. Shalom, salam, peace. My name is Jose Casanova. I'm professor of sociology, theology, and a senior fellow here at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And both personally and on behalf of Sean Casey, the director of the Berkley Center, who unfortunately could not be with us here today, I extend to all of you a warm welcome, particularly all of those of you who had accepted to be panelists in this exciting conference. This is the second of two conferences dealing with issues of religious legitimation of violence and religious resources to delegitimize, to desacralize violence, and to contribute to peacemaking. The first conference took place a year ago, practically exactly a year ago, in Trento, and was co-organized by Reset Doc, Dialogue of Civilizations. Giancarlo Bossetti, the director, will offer welcoming remarks in a moment, and the Bruno Kessler Foundation, the director, Marco Ventura, is also here today and will give the concluding remarks. I was not able to attend the first conference, but some of our colleagues, Gerard Manion, who is the co-organizer of this conference, the second conference, and some of our colleagues from Georgetown were able to take part. And we are very pleased to organize this second conference here, particularly because it's one in which all the fellows of the Berkley Center have been involved. Each of us serves as moderator, convener, organizer of each of the panels. So it's a collective effort. After all, we have the name at the Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. So it was, I think, a good opportunity for all of us to become involved in this collective effort. The Berkley Center has 11 years of age, has been established precisely to do this kind of work that brings together academic research, scholarship on issues of religion, peace, and world affairs, but also engagement with public policy makers, public policy elites, government, national, international, also economic, NGOs, but also engage at the grassroots with people working for peace and social justice and development and interreligious dialogue. So it is this combination of research, engagement with public policy, and engagements also with grassroots active initiatives that characterizes what we do here at the Berkley Center. And we are very, very happy to welcome all of you. And now let me introduce Giancarlo Bossetti, who is the director of Reset Dialogue of Civilizations, a good friend who has been here already at the Berkley Center before, and who will also offer some welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. And let me, first of all, give my thanks to the partners and the organizers who have made this conference possible. As Jose said just a moment ago, following upon last year's meeting in Italy, the Berkley Center, with its remarkable researchers, and the Foundation Bruno Kessler, with its prestigious Department of Religious Studies. It is not the first time I have had the pleasure of being hosted here exactly in this place, one of the first events of the U.S. branch of Reset Dialogues also took place right here. I have very fond memories of that meeting, which helped launch a new phase of collaboration with our network of international scholars who work on pluralism, who works on peace and human rights in different contexts, and on the relationship between different cultures and traditions. This is what lies the core of our work at Reset Dialogues, which for the last 15 years has been organizing international seminars in Istanbul, Venice, Delhi, Tunis, and Casablanca, where we have a summer school for religious and cultural pluralism. I encourage everyone to take a look at our websites and our videos, our articles, and our things, and to get involved by signing our newsletter. End of promotion of ZDoc. Well, I'm very excited. We are excited to collaborate with all of you who are assembled here. And I also want to recognize the significant contributions of Jose Casanova, of Gerard Magnon, of Deborah Tonelli and Marco Ventura, who have helped this relationship blossom. Please allow me to briefly address the origins of the idea of our interest in religions exiting violence. I have a personal debt toward a person which is not here anymore. As a new association of scholars, we began working on the relationship between violence. Sorry.
Reminder
I'm sorry, I
all
forgot.
of us to turn off the ringers of our cell phones.
We began working on the relationship between violence and the sacred after 9/11. That was not, of course, a particularly original endeavor. There had already been much path-breaking work before that day, since religiously inspired terrorism had been rising in the decade before 9/11, and a number of ongoing violent conflicts were associated with different confessional affiliation. But it was a young sociologist from Rome named Massimo Rosati who pushed us to work on the specific issue of how and when religions become a source of violence, and then how and when they leave that role and take on the complementary function of becoming an agent of peace and cohesion. Massimo, who unexpectedly and sadly died at the age of 44, wanted to launch this initiative with me and Deborah, and he is sorely missed today. His participation would have further enriched our discussion. As an analyst of social order and as someone who was inspired by the teaching of his dear Émile Durkheim, Massimo used to say that if you think that you can eradicate violence by removing the sacred from our vocabulary, then you are ignoring how our social world functions, and you are choosing to embrace an infantile understanding of enlightenment. In that instance, he was referring to the role of faith, communities in the campaign to abolish the death penalty, and to their role in the enduring conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. It was clear to him, as it remains to us, that in so many situations of our contemporary world, religion has an ambiguous and ambivalent influence. It is either the determining factor of peace or war, or intolerance or reconciliation, all depending upon the choices made by social and political actors. To quote one of us, if I may, from the discussion in Trento last year, this implicates the interpretive stance that people take towards two kinds of holy texts. On one where we find a mix of sacralization of the violence and one group against another, and another which precisely expound the prophetic critique of violence, the promise of peace, and especially the end of sacrifice. So sometimes we have religion on the side of many conflicts in our world of today as a fuel, high-octane fuel that is triggering conflicts, and at other moments we recall those battles we would never have ended without the support of faith communities and the religious actors. Within every religious tradition, there is a confrontation, and this is a dynamic which is critical to any present or future progress. A confrontation between an intransigent and exclusivist wing on the one hand, and another wing more inclined towards dialogue and negotiation. Between interpreters who are entrenched in an unalterable version of the divine message on one side, and their opponents inclined to question it on the other. Those who accept its historicity, the historicity of the religious experience, to quote a Muslim scholar like Abdul Filali Ansari, its immersion in different eras, traditions, and above all within the accidental and fallible nature of human beings. This means accepting the novelty of the science of the times, recognizing the other with his and her dignity, with his and her relationship to the experience of truth and of the possibility of salvation. A kind of confrontation that I personally find of extreme interest in the Catholic Church, as well inside the Shia leadership, or as well inside the Hindu leadership. Our first conference focused more on the Holy Scriptures and the sacred narratives of the origins as related to violence. In Trento, there were several excellent contributions on the topic within Jewish, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, and also Muslim tradition. And now, with the present conference, we are moving towards a socio-historical approach to the religious legitimation of violence. But we are also committed to the analysis of religious practices of nonviolence and peacebuilding within the Christian and Muslim tradition. I'm very happy to see that the format of today's and tomorrow's session allow for substantive interaction and active discussion, which will enhance the final results that we care of and that we are able to achieve with this exciting collaboration. Good job to everyone, good job to all of us.
Thank you. So now we can start. Please, I ask my colleagues, Ivan, Gustavo, Stephen, to join us here, the panel. We begin with Catholicism and political violence in Latin America. Usually when people talk of religion and violence today, immediately the word is on Islam. We wanted really to focus on the long history also of the role of Christianity in political violence. So we begin with first a panel on Latin America, and then we have a panel on evangelical Christianity and racial violence in the United States, and then we'll continue with other experiences. Now, Latin America, of course, is or was a homogeneous Catholic continent until the 1960s. The 1960s was a time of radical transformation, the Cuban Revolution, the Vatican II and its aftermath in Latin America, Medellin, and the emergence of all kinds of movements of sacerdotes del tercer mundo in Argentina, basically for revolutionary transformations. La Golconda, another movement of priests in Colombia, parallel to Medellin. We are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Medellin this year. So together with us, we have three experts, three distinguished panelists. First, Gustavo Morello, who is a Jesuit father from Argentina, a professor of sociology at Boston College, and who is joining us today. Thank you very much. Ivan Garzón, who is a professor of political science at another Catholic university, but this time La Sabana in the outskirts of Bogota, an Opus Dei university. Ivan Garzón has written extensively on issues of liberalism and public reason in the public sphere. His book on Jan Rawls has written on religion in the public sphere, but has also been very much interested in understanding the role of religion in the long history of political conflicts in his country, in Colombia. And then we have Steve Hedge, who is a senior expert on Colombia at the United States Institute for Peace. He has nearly 2 decades of professional experience working on issues related to peace process, human rights, security sector reform, local governance, and natural resource-related organized crime. He currently leads UCIP's efforts in Colombia supporting implementation of the peace accord with FARC rebels. So we are going to follow the following structure. I will ask the panelists to begin with some brief initial statements, 10 to 15 minutes. We'll begin first with Colombia and with Argentina and Colombia, trying to understand the Catholic legitimation of violence on the left and on the right. And then we'll move to the question of how from legitimation of violence to peacemaking, the peace process, and we'll then turn to Steve, and we'll go back then forth. After a conversation among ourselves, we'll open the floor for discussion and questions. So, Gustavo, you've written 2 major books, one, Cristianismo y Revolución, which was, of course, a journal of engaged Christians, precisely in Buenos Aires, engaged and committed to the revolution as Christians. Following the Cuban Revolution, you see here in one page you have Che Guevara. Here in the back you have Camilo Torres, the revolutionary priest. So here we have an attempt to understand, through critical analysis of this journal, what were the rationales, the religious grounds for the legitimation of revolutionary violence. And then you wrote this other book, The Catholic Church and Argentina's Dirty War. We have not only legitimation of violence from below, we had legitimation of violence from above, a state violence, a state terror, a dirty war, frequently directed against precisely those Catholics committed to social justice and not necessarily to violence. The book precisely traces the fate of 6 La Salette seminarians who, along with many other priests, who were the so-called curas villeros, who had simply left the parishes to be working in the villas, in the shanty towns of Buenos Aires and many other cities. And these seminarians from La Salette, North Americans, also made the same engagement, the same commitment to work with the poor, the preferential option for the poor, and they were then subjects of state detention, violence, torture, with the basically approval of high members of the Catholic Church hierarchy. So bring us these 2 contradictory trends, or perhaps not so contradictory, how we got to this in Argentina.
Perfect. I circulate the journal, Cristianismo Revolución. As Jose mentioned, I am a Catholic and I like objects. I like material religion. So sometimes when we are doing research, we are talking about things that we don't have. And I think it's important to see the object. That's the journal that was legitimizing violence. Do you have the clip for the...
Do we have the...
I can... Okay,
Giancarlo, do you have it? No? Okay, sorry.
Here. So, first is the religious legitimation. Let me go there so I can have it here. From the left, Cristianismo Revolución was this journal that was published.
Mike.
Yes. Thank you. Cristianismo Revolución was this journal that was published in the 1966, 1971 in Argentina, and it paved the way for revolutionary violence among left-wing Catholics. It ended up in a network that was called the Camilos, because of Camilo Torres, that ended up in Montoneros, which was the biggest guerrilla in Argentinian history. The main contribution, many factors contributed to the development of Cristianismo Revolución. The magazine was one spread all over Argentina. So it was a link, it was a material connection between revolutionary Catholic groups in Argentina. Second point was the theology behind Cristianismo, the journal Cristianismo y Revolución. They were debating the Second Vatican Reform, and they were encouraging people to talk about what was going on there. We don't have a Second Amendment in our Constitution, so we have to justify that we are going to bear weapons against the government. It's not an easy thing from Argentina to bear weapons against the government. We have to justify that. And that was the role of Cristianismo y Revolución. The question, can a Catholic be a revolutionary, became the only way to be a true Catholic is to be a revolutionary. And that was the shift in the theology in Cristianismo y Revolución. They take some teachings from the Populorum Progressio, I will mention it a little later, the manifesto of the 18 bishops of the Third World, that was a post-conciliar document, and of course, Medellin, were ways of legitimizing their violence. However, it was the figure of Camilo Torres and the Che Guevara, the Argentinian guerrilla, who enlightened, who in certain way made the glasses of the journal. The motto of Camilo Torres, the duty of every Christian is to be a revolutionary. And the other from Che Guevara, the duty of every revolutionary is to make the revolution, became the motto of the journal. And all the material that they published was through those glasses. That was the glass that they used, the prisma that they used to read all the other material that was going on. The reasoning proposed by Cristianismo Revolución was that the poor had created the wealth, proprietors took it from them because they controlled the state apparatus. By describing the social problem as a sin, they open up the door for the intervention of the Christian. You cannot be indifferent in front of a sin. It was a sin of injustice. In that way, they appealed to the moral desire of Catholic readers to redeem their neighbors and rescue them from suffering. The aim was to conquer power so as to build a better world where everybody could live a decent life. Therefore, the revolution was a Christian duty. And you can see that in the editorials that were signed by the director of the journal, but in the selection of the material that they were doing from other sources. Another element for the legitimization of violence was that in 1955, a coup d'etat has removed Juan Perón from power. I know that talking about Peronism is a big issue and it's a big problem about Argentinians and populists and is he close to Trump or whatsoever. No, I don't think so. Because Perón built a welfare state. But Perón was perceived as a dictatorship from some liberal forces who banned him. You couldn't say the name of Perón. Saying the name of Perón was a crime in Argentinian law. You couldn't vote for him since 1955 to 1973. Even if you didn't like him, that meant banning from the political participation almost 0.5% of the population. That delegitimized the political system. So Cristianismo Revolution wasn't advocating for democracy. They wanted a revolution because democracy was a failure, was a fake. So the delegitimization of the political system was part of the legitimization of the political violence. That's what I'm trying to say. In such scenario, Christians had to choose sides. Catholics should commit themselves either to the revolution or against the revolution. We Christians, says García Elorrio, quoting Camilo Torres, we Christians should incorporate into it, since revolution is the only efficacious way to achieve love for all. They draw some legitimization. Again, they didn't care about the legitimization of the church structure, because if Second Vatican Council has said that the church is the people of God, they only need the legitimization of the people of God. However, they will use this quotation many times of Populorum Progressio number 31, and I read Populorum Progressio. Everyone knows, however, that revolutionary uprisings, except where there is manifest long-standing tyranny, which would do great damage to fundamental personal rights and dangerous harm to the common good of the country, engender new injustices, introduce new inequities, and bring new disasters. So if you read the sentence without the brackets, it's everyone knows, however, that revolutionary uprisings engender new injustices, introduce new inequalities, and bring new disasters. However, that parenthesis saying, unless in case of a long-lasting tyranny, was the reason for them to say, okay, this is a long-lasting tyranny. We are facing this. So they updated the doctrine of tyrannicide and said, okay, it was a tyrant, now it's a system. So we can do a revolution, we can make a revolution against the system. The other case, it was on the right-wing side. So this journal ended up 71. 74, we started under the democratic government with state terrorism, and we have the military coup d'etat and the dictatorship in Argentina. The dictatorship used something that is called the doctrine of national security doctrine, that was banned by the Document of Puebla. Document of Puebla says that it was a kind of problem for a Christian believer or Catholic believer to follow that kind of doctrine. Despite that condemnation, some sectors in Argentina embrace that kind of doctrine. This in the frame of the Cold War, and the doctrine was adapted in different ways. Like in the case of Brazil, you wouldn't find the religious overtones to this employment of the national security doctrine. Same case in Uruguay, no religious overtone. It was more modernizing the country, changing the backward kind of country that we are, moving into progress or whatsoever. So the religious overtone of the national security doctrine was a kind of Argentinian phenomenon. It started, the national security doctrine started in Argentina, or reached Argentina in the 50s under the French influence. The Cuban Revolution awoke the interest. The main point is the ideological borders. There is a fight between Western and the Western world and the communist world. That borders are within the country, are within the culture, and we have to choose sides. If you are not defending the Western Christian civilization, you are a communist, and that was the thing. Latin American Catholics have to choose sides, either with the state, confronting the enemy within, as this was called, or being suspected of being infiltrators. In the case of Argentina, what do they mean by the Western Christian civilization? To understand the problems, they said, the military said, and there were a couple of generals, General Vilas, General Díaz-Bezones, who wrote books explaining the situation at that point. They said that the problem started with the Lutheran Reformation and the French Revolution. So what is the Western world after that? I mean, like if you take away the Christian Reformation, the Lutheran Reformation, and the French Revolution. According to General Vilas, Protestantism and liberalism were the sources of the decadence that led to Marxism. The proof of this was the politics of the Carter administration. Carter echoed the denunciations of human rights abuses, showing support for the communists. Those who proposed the national security doctrine could not trust the Western democracies. Because of these ideas, I call them anti-secular Catholics. They were against any kind of negotiation, democratic negotiation with these other ideas. The Cold War justified the paralegal tactics. The idea of a religious crusade justified the ethical problems, or give them reason to overlook the ethical problems that arise from that. Here is a notebook from the journal of Monsignor Tortolo. Monsignor Tortolo was an auxiliary bishop of the military bishopric in Argentina. This journal is from January 1976, before the coup d'etat. And he was talking about problems in troubles in Tucumán. Tucumán is a northern district in Argentina where there was a big guerrilla fight. So the military was taking over the guerrilla. There was a guerrilla group trying to do a kind of Sierra Maestra, Argentina Sierra Maestra, like in the Cuban Revolution, taking over the country and form that focus that was Tucumán. And Monsignor Tortolo wrote, Problems in Tucumán, regarding tortures and prisoners. So it seemed that the chaplains were going to tell him, were telling him, okay, we are torturing people. There is a problem here. We saw that going on. It seems that the generals, and there are some entries in the journal that general soldiers are telling him, I have some issues torturing people. His solution is a Thomist argument. St. Thomas said that sometimes it's licit the capital punishment. Torture is less than killing someone, ergo, you can torture people. In his handwriting. Anti-secular Catholics have no nuances. They were either you were an anti-secular Catholic or you weren't a Catholic. You were an infiltrator. You were someone who was trying to destroy the church. I did research on the case of the bishop in Cordoba, a very conservative bishop, Cardenal Primatesta. He has been, and some people, James Brennan from California, disliked my treat of Primatesta because he said that I apologized him and he was a bad guy. He used a stronger word. However, for the military, Primatesta was a suspicious person. He wasn't anti-secular enough. He was supportive of Paul VI. I mean, he was a bishop. But they accused him of being supportive of the Pope because the military was more on the branch of Lefebvre and that kind of very anti-secular Catholicism, whose main representative in Argentina was Cardinal Tortolo, who is the bishop who is referred here in this entrance, in this journal. They were looking to recatholize the society. The objective was to reconquer society and expel the enemies of the faith, who were therefore the enemies of the state. The discussion of the role of religion in the society relied on the debate for national identity and what did it mean to be an Argentinian. The disputes on political and religious senses overlap constantly, and the state turned into the custodian of the Catholic orthodoxy. If to be an Argentinian you have to be a Catholic, the military have to be in control of what does it mean to be a Catholic, because otherwise you will have someone who is not the truly Argentinian there. So the state has to control that. They were, to what extent what Jose says in his first book, the idea that, okay, it's a national church that overlaps with the political community, and for that reason the political authorities have to take care of the church. This version of Catholicism also justified, legitimized who was the enemy. That they pointed to whom to attack. The repressive struggle, more than the military combat, was a spiritual and philosophical struggle against secularization and those who embodied it at that moment in Argentinian society. They legitimized the actions with a religious seal. Liberal secularization was the enemy that subverted a way of life that threatened and had infiltrated even the Catholic Church. The relocation of the church in the public space and the ecclesiastical pluralism were perceived as moral corruption. The fear led certain Catholic sectors to support the terrorist state. One final story, because it sounds crazy, but when I was interviewing the people who was at the torture chamber, they were witness of other questioners. And the military will ask the guerrilla women who were in detention to explain the birth control methods. Because for them, if you use any birth control method, you were a communist. You couldn't be a Christian, a truly Christian. So, I mean, to what extent that's mean? That's what I mean by anti-secularization. Like they were against any kind of negotiation with modernity. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Ivan, from Catholic Argentina, we moved to even more Catholic Colombia. Colombia is a very conservative Catholic country. The Catholic Church has had tremendous power, very close to all the oligarchic structures, political, economic. And so you had Medellin, and Medellin also produced this kind of tripartite separation, very similar to the three types of Catholics. You have the left-wing Catholics for revolution, you call them the romantic rebels. You have the right-wing Catholics opposing the guerrillas, and then you have much of the church in the middle between left and right, but not taking a clear, active voice for peacemaking until very late. So,
Sure.
how do you explain this long-lasting violence from the 40s, a decade of violence, then these 50 years of guerrillas that took so long to, and what has been the role of the Catholic Church in this whole dynamic?
Sure. So, good morning to everyone. Thank you, Jose, and the Berkley Center for inviting me. And my presentation is related, it's a part of a book that I am finishing related to the political and religious violence in the 60s and 70s. Specifically the justification and the criticism of the violence. My presentation is about two figures of the Catholicism in Colombia in the 60s. This it's a part of a research that I did a colleague of mine in Colombia, and the title is The Rebel and the Prophet. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X represent two radically different responses to violence and non-violence in the civil rights movement to vindicate the rights of Black people in the United States during the 60s. Dr. King was the most prominent defender of nonviolence at that time, since he not only understood that it was an effective strategy for social change, but it was also at the heart of his philosophy of life. In this context of the arms race that prevailed during that period, he realized that the acquisition of nuclear arms by several nations created a situation in which the option would no longer be between nonviolence and violence, but between nonviolence and non-existence. Influenced by liberal Protestant theology and the philosophy of personalism, King learned the centrality of love, especially towards one's enemies, from Jesus, and how to use love as an instrument for the transformation of society from Gandhi. Like Martin Luther King Jr., the political activism of Malcolm X was also inspired by his religious faith. He became a member of Elijah Muhammad Nation of Islam in 1948 and received the influence of its Manichaean theology that considered everything white to be evil and everything black to be good. Nonetheless, it was above all the philosophy of Black nationalism, which emphasized self-respect and self-defense, that inspired his imagination and political commitment. Therein, precisely, lies his principal political cleavage in his fierce defense of the rights of blacks to self-defense in response to the racist aggressions of whites, since he believed that the only way to balance the burdens was to give whites a taste of their own medicine. That is to say, he justified retaliatory violence as a necessary response to criminal acts committed against the black population. His anger and provocative language define his activism. Quote, "If you want to know what I will do, figure out what you will do. I will do the same thing, only more of it. End of quote. A similar phenomenon occurred in that same decade in Colombia. Father Camilo Torres Restrepo and Bishop Gerardo Valencia Cano coincided with respect to the idea of promoting a social change that will correct social injustices. However, the means that they preached differed completely because the guerrilla priest moved away from the ecclesiastical life into the realm of politics, and from there to the guerrilla. While the bishop of Buenaventura, a port of the south of the country in the Pacific, remained within the ecclesiastical orbit, but never abandoned his permanent connection to social commitment. To put it another way, while Torres took the path of violence, Valencia always openly rejected that possibility. Actually, following the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, a moral and political debate arose in Latin America regarding the justification or criticism of violence as a means for achieving political ends. In Colombia, two Catholic priests were the respective reference for these different paths. Camilo Torres, the guerrilla priest, and Gerardo Valencia, the Red Bishop, who both stood out as Christian revolutionaries for their critiques of capitalism and the political system, as well as their search for social justice. These were undoubtedly the two main religious figures in Colombia during the 60s. On the one hand, there was Camilo Torres Restrepo, known as the guerrilla priest, a rebel priest, a native of Bogota and member of an affluent upper-class family. He was educated in Belgium, in Catholic University of Lovaina, and became one of the pioneers of sociological studies in Colombia. He spent most of his clerical life as chaplain of the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, where he came into contact with all types of political groups. He was one of the major critics of the political pact known as the Frente Nacional, which was signed between the two traditional political parties, liberal and conservative, in 1957. He attempted to create a pluralistic opposition movement known as Frente Unido, with the support of small organizations. But it eventually collapsed because it failed to obtain a sufficiently large number of followers. At the same time, Torres also faced serious discrepancies with the hierarchy due to his gradual radicalization, which would finally lead to his decision to join the newly created guerrilla of the ELN, in English, National Liberation Army, in which he died at the beginning of 1966 in the midst of a combat with the Colombian army, only 5 months after Camilo joined to the guerrilla. On the other hand, Gerardo Valencia Cano was born in the small town of Santo Domingo in the department of Antioquia. He did his studies in the Instituto de Misiones de Yarumal under the attentive observation of Monsignor Miguel Ángel Builes, who precisely is currently is in process of being canonized by Pope Francis. A bishop well known for his intransigency and ultra-conservative positions, Builes. Valencia was assigned as apostolic prefect to the Amazon region of Baupés, and years afterwards, he will be designated bishop of the port city of Buenaventura. He will later participate in definitive events in the history of the Catholic Church, such as Vatican Council II in Rome and the General Conference of the Latin American Episcopate in Medellin. He was also assigned to be president of the Missions Commission of the CELAM. However, Valencia's pastoral life would not be free from controversy. His radical social commitment, his defense of Christian socialism, and his participation in the Golconda Group will give him the epithet of the Red Bishop. Like Camilo Torres, he also met a tragic end, being killed in an airplane accident in 1972. The following chart show the comparative. It's a comparison with Valencia and Camilo related to three dimensions: personal, institutional, and the political proposal. So, finally, what can explain the distancing between the different forms of political praxis of these two Christian revolutionaries? The main difference between them lies in the role that each assigned to violence as a tool for political action. Torres was a defender of armed struggle and the establishment of intellectual bridges with Marxism, which led to his break with the hierarchy and the political system. Valencia, on the contrary, preached nonviolence, and his proposal had an evangelical, reformist, and communitarian base. The final report of the Historic Commission on the Armed Conflict and its Victims, created in the context of peace process in 2015, shows that both positions continue to bear on the public debate about war and peace in Colombia. Thank you.
Why did it take so long for the peace process to begin? What were the main difficulties? And what were the triggers that finally made it possible? And what was the role of Catholic groups in the peacemaking process from above, from below? Tell us where we are also now in the peace process, how fragile it still is.
Great. Thank you very much, Jose. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Ivan and Gustavo, particularly here at Georgetown. I'm talking about these figures, Camilo Torres and others. Actually, as an undergrad, finishing my undergrad at Boston College, received a Fulbright scholarship to study the role of the Catholic Church in the context of the Colombian armed conflict. At that time, you couldn't have a Fulbright scholarship they wouldn't approve you to study the conflict directly. You had to have some sort of intermediary. And so, because I had studied theology at Boston College, I had a chance to study the conflict through the eyes and prisms of the Catholic Church, grappling with these questions of what is the role of these different segments of the Catholic Church in Colombia in efforts to bring about a peaceful solution to the conflict, and how were local communities inspired to certain extents by liberation theology? How are they navigating the fact that the war had transformed itself through illicit economies and through massive amounts of violence on all sides into a scenario that wasn't so black and white in the views of liberation theologists in the 60s and 70s? So I'll hold some of my reflections from that time, but the one thing I will say is that from my 2 years in Colombia, at that time, I've worked in Colombia in many different capacities since then, but focusing on this specific issue, one of the interesting things that I came about or came across was this transition from a vision of liberation to a new vision of a new utopic vision of a kingdom of God, to understanding the inspiration of the Catholic vision towards more of a resistance ideology within the Catholic Church. And this has huge implications for peace today. This shift to the idea of resistance versus liberation, of moving forward in history to a new future towards resisting the imposition of different forces, neoliberal, economic, social, conservative, anything. This has, as I said, extremely important consequences today, and the role of the Catholic Church and Catholic theology amongst armed actors. I'll speak a little bit about, mostly I'll share my responses, or my remarks, excuse me, on the FARC, but I just come from several days in Havana, Cuba, meeting with the ELN. And Paulo Beltran, who's the head of the ELN's peace delegation right now with the government, is still deeply, deeply moved and inspired by a view of liberation theology from the 60s and 70s. After Camilo Torres, we forget the head of the ELN for almost 3 decades, was a Spanish priest by the name of Manuel Perez. His right-hand man throughout all of those years was Paulo Beltran. And Paulo Beltran is still the one leading the peace efforts within the ELN today. Thank you, appreciate it. So Catholic liberation theology and the role, the Catholic view of the world from the 60s and 70s is still deeply relevant in the way that the current government is engaging, the government of more right, center-right, depending on who you ask, is engaging in this peace process with the ELN. The commissioner, the High Commissioner for Peace, is someone who spent a lot of time within the National Conciliation Commission of the Catholic Church, deeply inspired also by Catholic values, Catholic social teaching, to reach a peace agreement. So we have Catholic-inspired leaders on both sides of the ELN process currently today trying to find a solution. But returning back to the FARC process, which is most commonly understood as the Colombian peace process, I consistently try to distinguish between what is a FARC peace process or peace negotiations, and therefore then the implementation of that agreement, the November 2016 agreement, with then an ELN peace process that really the actual agenda and negotiations didn't start until several months after the FARC agreement had begun. And has been going on since 2012, but has also had many suspensions, many ruptures, changes of delegations from both sides that have slowed down the process. And we're in another one of those suspensions, unfortunately, today in that peace process. So the Catholic Church, I'll share a little bit of background on just general roles and ways in which the Catholic Church has been supportive of peace since the mid-'80s. A little bit about their role in the FARC negotiations, which was somewhat relatively limited compared to other processes. I'll share a little bit of remarks on the plebiscite, the October 2nd, 2016 plebiscite on the FARC peace agreement, and the role of the Catholic Church both before and after that. And then the very important Pope's visit in September 2017, 11 months after that plebiscite. And then a couple of remarks on the implementation of that FARC agreement. Finally, on the role of the Catholic Church in the ELN process, which has been much more proactive, much more formal in many ways. So, dating back to the 1980s, we see a shift within the Bishops' Council within Colombia to begin to think more about a negotiated solution to the conflict. The Catholic Church's support for the idea of negotiations with the wide variety of insurgent groups in the 1980s, we didn't just have the FARC, we had the FARC and the ELN, we had several other groups. And the Catholic Church support to that process, which led ultimately to the 1991 Constitution, which as Ivan would share more remarks on, was really dramatic in terms of the history and the role of Catholicism in Colombia, shifting very clearly from an 1886 constitution in which the Catholic Church was essentially the official religion with huge prerogatives, huge importance within Colombian society, to a much more secular constitution in 1991. And the Catholic Church endorsed that and supported and accompanied that process, to the surprise of many. And that was very critical, I think, in that transition to a more democratic, liberal security and governance structure. Throughout that time in the 1980s and 1990s, the Catholic Church continued to play a mediator role, unblocking attempts at negotiations both with the FARC and the ELN. At a very quiet level, bishops throughout the country were very critical in helping to release kidnapped victims throughout the country, both by the ELN, both by the FARC, doing this at their own peril at many times, and putting many of their communities in the front lines, but trying to protect them in many ways from both actors at this time in the 1990s. A very brutal, reactionary group of paramilitaries was also targeting communities that were suspected of being supportive of either the FARC or the ELN. And the Catholic Church was certainly a very important player in defending human rights, monitoring and verifying those important historic massacres that took place throughout that time. Now, the FARC negotiations began in 2012. There was failed negotiations between 1998 and 2001, and we have essentially 11 years of pause in those in attempts at official negotiations with the FARC. The FARC has a historically antagonistic relationship with the Catholic Church dating back to the 1950s. The FARC's sort of a break-off splinter radical group of the Liberal Party in the 1950s. We have hundreds of thousands of people killed between conservatives and liberals in Colombia, and the Catholic Church very much positioned itself aside the conservative party. And so the FARC in being a part of that historical shift from a liberal party to an insurgent communist rebel movement continued to view the Catholic Church as part of the elite, part of the establishment, which they wanted to transform and to overcome. Ironically, in the past, the FARC has been really interested in negotiating with conservative elite leaders. So in 1998 and 2001 with President Pastrana, this was something that they saw, we need to negotiate with the far right in order to make transformations in Colombia. However, that wasn't the case with Santos. You have a much more, who comes from the far right, becomes a much more centrist, even liberal figure in many ways. So the Catholic Church does not play a very critical, important role in the FARC negotiations at the early stages. However, when the process begins to open up a little bit from a very closed agenda, with very limited participation of individuals outside of the direct negotiations in Havana, the Catholic Church plays an important role in identifying victims groups to be sent to Havana to contribute their voices, ensuring that those victims are represented from all sides, not only victims of the state, but also victims of the FARC. It also played an important role in beginning to prepare the ground for certain degrees of reconciliation throughout Colombia, particularly in areas where it would be anticipated would be very tense process of transitioning from a FARC administration in rural parts of Colombia to a government control. Now, when that process begins to come to an end, and it's seen that there will be a plebiscite, President Santos said very clearly, we don't want everyone here around the table. That was the part of the process, the problem in certain ways with the 1998 to 2001 negotiations with President Pastrana. We had too many actors around the table, and so President Santos' approach was one very reduced, limited role. There had to be real struggle to get these victims groups to be able to come to the table. But there was Santos said, we will have a plebiscite, the referendum. You will be able to choose at the end whether you accept this or not. And this will be ultimately you will have the last say in this peace accord. The Catholic Church before the October 2nd, 2016 plebiscite, disappointingly for others, rightly for some, did not take an official position either way on the plebiscite, but did encourage individuals to participate, to vote, to inform themselves on the process, did continue to support the idea of that this would be an opportunity for greater reconciliation. In several communications said that they very much welcome the possibility of peace, and they respected the idea that the population and people themselves would be able to choose whether they would support this particular document. The Catholic Church position, there is a peace process in which we are all a part of, and we all want peace, but this is a document, and you're going to choose whether you approve or not of this document. However, several very critical, important leaders of the Catholic Church did openly say, in one case, Monsignor Dario Monsalve, all honest citizens would give their vote for the yes. And this created a great deal of tension. Some of these statements by Augusto. Monsignor Castro also said later in response to that, yes, it would be great if the plebiscite won, but if it doesn't, we will have more opportunities to work towards a peace process, and that the process would continue regardless. And that was something, so when the process fails, to a certain extent, and we won't go into all those details, when the plebiscite fails, certain conservative Catholic leaders, and not only Catholic leaders of the church, but of Catholic lay groups who joined forces with evangelical groups to oppose the agreement on the basis that it brought around a gender ideology. And this was very critical in terms of the interpretation of what the implications of the FARC agreement would be. There was a concern that it would transform families, that it would change the way individuals understood their gender identity. And this, unfortunately, was not actually in the text. There was an introduction of terms of gender that came, ironically, because of victims groups were bringing that to the table, and there was accommodations that were made for those victim groups. However, the Catholic Church, in terms of the Bishops' Conference, the day after October 3rd, releases a statement in trying to bring the country together. Extremely polarized country between those who supported the agreement and those that didn't. And when 2 months later, when the accord was renegotiated to a certain extent with some leaders of those who opposed it, the Catholic Church did endorse that version of the text. And traveled to Havana, met with the FARC, which was extremely important symbolically, committed to then supporting the implementation. And that's been something that the church then has worked extremely diligently on. Some of its efforts for peace pedagogy have been extended to then the implementation of the FARC agreement. There's still continued a really important week for peace that happens every September. Hundreds of organizations come around the Catholic Church's call for peace education, a culture of peace, a culture of forgiveness, of reconciliation, and elements of that to accommodate some of those more conservative groups within the Catholic Church, an emphasis on family values, an emphasis on the importance of parents and the role that they play in building a culture within families for individuals to not join criminal groups. However, throughout the implementation process, the church has also been very, very critical at certain stages. In May 2018, the Catholic Church held a very important meeting in Cali of lay leaders, bishops from around the country, and expressed a number of very important concerns about the process, but always calling on the governments, and at that time beginning the presidential campaigns, calling on candidates to build on what had already been built. The idea of that this is a foundation. If we want to make any change to this, we need to build on this basis. But denouncing the increase in violence in certain parts of the country, the assassination of social leaders, the lack of implementation of really key reforms around agrarian and land laws that were at the really core of the FARC agreement. These were things that came out at different times. I'll just say very quickly, going back to the Pope's visit in September 2017 was extremely important. At one time, the Pope said, there was a certain understanding that his visit would be conditioned on whether the plebiscite passed. The FARC wanted the Pope to come right before the plebiscite, and he said, if it passes, we'll come in the first part of 2017. Now, it obviously didn't pass, and as I said, the Bishops' Conference did support then the new version of the text. But in September 2017, the Pope comes finally to support. This is several months after the FARC had already laid down all of their their weapons, and they're beginning a very tenuous process of transitioning to civilian life. There's a lot of question marks around the key elements of the agreement, whether they would be translated into laws before the end of the Santos government. And to a certain degree, the Pope's visit gives sort of an enormous boost to those efforts. He's also very outspoken, although trying to walk a very fine line because of these divisions within the Catholic Church. He openly at one point criticizes those bishops who opposed the peace agreements, saying, you're not technicians or politicians, you are pastors. You should be supportive of all efforts that are in favor of a peaceful solution to this conflict. And this was taken as a subtle message, but with deep echoes across the Catholic Church, that the support for peace, and particularly this implementation process, shouldn't be an open discussion within the Catholic Church. And at that point forward, you have a little bit more cohesion within the Bishops' Conference, again accommodating certain elements of language of building in family values, certain more conservative elements, even in for letters throughout the implementation, there's always a line about this gender ideology, which is still included, even though it wasn't in either version of the FARC agreement. Those accommodations are still made, but you have a much more resounding support, largely in part of the Pope's visit. Now, I'll just quickly end with the ELN process, which also it begins in 2012. As I said, the agenda isn't confirmed or finished until 2016. The actual negotiations first in Quito and now in Havana didn't get started until February 2017, so several months after the FARC agreement. And there the Catholic Church plays a much more proactive role. Both the National Conciliation Commission, which is the forum of lay leaders supported by the Catholic Church, lay leaders from across the political and socioeconomic spectrum, play an important role in generating support for that process, providing good offices at different points. And ultimately, prior to the Pope's visit, a huge impetus to create a bilateral ceasefire. In the history of 27 years of negotiations, on and off negotiations between the Colombian state and the ELN, there had never been a ceasefire. And as a result of the Pope's visit, there is this impetus to quickly push for a ceasefire that would allow the Pope to move around the country. It was designed to be 101 days, and the actors called on the Catholic Church to play a verifying and monitoring role in that ceasefire alongside the UN. At the end of the 101 days, the Church designates 20 bishops to play an important role as mediators with the ELN. The ELN said, we don't want to interact and provide information to the UN because they're on the side of the Colombian army. So finally, there's an agreement to have 20 priests who will be liaison officers essentially in the verification structure of that ceasefire with the ELN. Unfortunately, for many reasons we won't get into this morning, that ceasefire ends January 9th of this year, and we've been working since January 9th to renew a bilateral ceasefire. The Catholic Church has continued to play an extremely important role throughout that process, holding talks at the Bishops' Conference in Bogota, sending delegations to both Quito and Havana, and in many ways has a critical role, and I'll just end there in terms of helping this new government understand the history of the ELN, why the ELN, negotiating with the ELN is not like negotiating with the FARC. You cannot just have a transactional agreement, a rational transactional agreement with the ELN, as one might, essentially was the case with the FARC. You will hand over our arms in exchange for political participation and agrarian reform, essentially is in very simplistic terms. With the ELN, this is a deeply committed movement about both resistance, armed resistance, as I said, really entrenched in the idea of armed resistance to the new government, but also a very deeply mystical movement that doesn't often think in very practical, rational ways. And so therefore a spiritual contribution to those discussions, even the agenda itself is very difficult to grasp. The terms are very broad and abstract. And the Catholic Church continues to play a really critical role from not only institutionally, but helping to understand and ground that mythological view that the ELN wants to transform Colombia society into much more practical, applicable actions that can be taken to move forward. So we're hopeful that this discussion continues to be a part of Colombian discussions as it relates to the FARC implementation peace process, the peace accord process, implementation process with the FARC, and the ongoing talks with the ELN. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's try to bring a conversation together of Argentina, Colombia, and all of Latin America. You mentioned the Cura Perez, guerrilla leader of the ENL. Of course, he was one of 3 young priests from my own diocese of Zaragoza. I was in the minor seminary when they were ordained priests, and soon thereafter they went as missionaries to Colombia. First they went as cura villeros. They were thrown out of the country and came back clandestinely and joined the guerrilla. Domingo Laín was killed soon thereafter, and Manuel Pérez and José Antonio Jiménez. Those were 3 priests from 3 small villages, Alfamén, Ariño, Paniza, small villages very close to my own village. And so you have these transnational also dynamics of the time, the same way you have missionary from all over North America, in Central America. So those are parts of the whole dynamic of the global Catholic Church. Reconciliation, peace process. What happened in Argentina? Where are we in this coming to terms with this history? As you know, we all know, Pope Francis played lately a crucial role in many of these peace processes. He's clearly an active peacemaker around the world. His own history as provincial of the Jesuit during the Dirty War was less successful in joining or in being able to bring together the left and the right-wing Jesuits. In this respect, you could say it was a failure from which apparently he has learned. It was part of his transformation also, his failure as an authority figure, as the provincial of the Jesuits, precisely unable to bring peace even within the order and to help those who had joined the guerrillas. In the transition to democracy, the Catholic Church in Argentina, unlike in Brazil, in Chile, and many other places, did not play a positive role at all. But obviously, it has been a transformation. Today we see Lucio Guerra, of course, one of the key figures in the Sacerdotes del Tercer Mundo, the great theologian of the people of God, you could say theologian that also influenced Bergoglio, and many of those ideas, at least the positive ideas of the 60s, purified from the articulation of revolutionary violence, are still on the agenda of the People's Church, the people of God. So where we are on these dynamics in Argentina, in Colombia?
I think in Argentina we are still a divided society upon this topic. And to some extent, I guess it's a backlash that we have now because we have a very progressive government in this regard. That was the Kirchner administration, the last Peronist administration, that was emphasizing the idea of vindication of what had happened. So it was a movement for memorializing the place, like many places where there were tortures or events that happened during the dictatorship became a kind of memorials or of center of memory and peace. And they opened up the doors for, like, the first democratic government in Argentina did a remarkable thing, I think still unique, that 3 years after the end of the dictatorship, they put the military, the generals, in court and condemned them. The militaries had failed in the Malvinas Falkland War, so they have no power. But that was what they could do at that point. But they didn't go they didn't go after the whole structure of the military power. And there was a law about that, like due obedience and final stop. We are not going to prosecute the rest of the people. The Kirchner administration started in 2003, overcome those laws, and everyone can go to trial. And there were about 800 militaries put back in court. Many of them accused of the kidnapping of the kids, because that was a crime of less humanity that wasn't judged at the very beginning, so it was the casus, the judiciary case for them to being brought back into court. So some people, or some right-wing groups, are calling for a complete history. So what about the crimes of the guerrillas? Why the state is not going after the killings of the guerrillas? Which is true, the state didn't go. There are like 700 victims of the guerrilla organizations in the Argentinian history, against, some sectors will say 30,000 victims of the military. I think the number is closer to 15,000 people killed by the military government. The point is that the military, when they took the power, they didn't go after the guerrillas who have killed other people. They disappear everyone. But when they were in charge of the rule, they didn't care about justice. So it was a kind of revenge that we are there at that point. So now we have again a neoliberal kind of center-right government with Macri. He's having some problems with or open up the door for people who are criticizing the politics of memory and remembrance of Argentina. But it's still a kind of hot issue in the society. The Pope, he wasn't the Pope when he was in Argentina during the 70s, so he was the province of the Jesuit provincial, which sounds very important, but who is the Jesuit provincial in Argentina now? Nobody cares. I mean, and that's the point. Nobody cares in 1976 when he was the Jesuit provincial. He was a Jesuit provincial, yeah. What does it mean? Like 100 guys who were Jesuits? I mean, it's not the big thing. In that sense, he has some power. He was a church leader, and we cannot be naive about that. And we cannot be naive about Bergoglio handling power. He knows how power works. He's a very wise person managing power. But he wasn't the powerful person that some will portray. I don't think he was a left-wing advocate. He was more on the institutional side of the church, trying to preserve the order or the situation, trying to take care of the people, but asking the people not to mess with political issues. So he wasn't proactive, engaging people to commit to some political claim. It was a kind of prudence or prudential measure that he took at that point. But there was a long-standing resistance to acknowledge the human rights groups in the Argentinian church, not only in Bergoglio, but in most of the bishops. They could deal with case, person to person, but not with a human rights organization. There was a problem with that. My hypothesis there is that the church wasn't able to deal with these kind of modern institutions, like the civil society, which is a kind of modern creation. The church couldn't deal with that. They have to learn to do that. And I think that Bergoglio has learned about this civil society kind of structure. He's allowing or pushing to some extent the church in Argentina to open up the archives, the file where they have all the information, to open up the information that they have. But even on that, I think there is still, in spite of the progress on the church administration, on the church hierarchy, there are some issues with the Catholic people that are there are division there about the situation. I think one big modification is that people is much more aware, the Argentinian people is much more aware of the role of the church in the public sphere. That is not a location where the church should be or should not be, but the role that the church plays in the public sphere. We have a Pope now that is criticizing the liberal economy, and it's very vocal about that. We have no doubts about that. And we have a very liberal government in Argentina. Poor people in Cordoba, I did interviews there, we was working with some interviews there. Poor people in Cordoba who loves the Pope, like his criticism about the financial system, don't like at all the Pope messing with Argentinian politics. They don't like the Pope talking about the president, they don't like the Pope taking pictures with politicians, even when the president is implementing the measures that the Pope criticized and they agree with the Pope. And I think it has to do, they like the church talking for the poor, they like the church preaching the word of God, they like the church doing church work, and they like this idea of humanism or trying to bring the people together. But they don't like the idea of the Pope playing as a politician in Argentinian politics. And I should have bring newspapers from Argentina, but it's like every day there is some news about the Pope agenda in the Argentinian newspaper. If you are a secular person in Argentina, it's a very bad time for you, because like every newspaper has something about the Pope. And I think it has to do with agency. In spite of all limitations of Argentinian political system, people have agency. They can vote. They can vote every 2 years for politicians. We cannot vote against the bankers. We don't choose the authorities of the International Monetary Fund. We have no say about global economy. So we need someone to represent us there, because we don't have voice in that level of power. But we do have voice with the government. So even if the government agrees with the International Monetary Fund, it's our government. And you, Pope, don't mess here. And I think that's a big change in Argentine politics.
I mean, Ivan, one of the paradoxes, of course, of Colombia was that all of this happened while there was a relatively vibrant democracy, right? So it was not that this was an authoritarian regime. It was, Colombia was one of the countries that avoided the bureaucratic authoritarian regimes of the 70s that spread all through Latin America. And so there is always an ambiguity about these two political processes going on simultaneously, and the role of the church, perhaps, in them. Again, there is still violence done against people involved in social justice struggles. I mean, obviously, we don't need to remember what happened to the Jesuits in El Salvador and what happens still today to people involved, whether in the Amazon or anybody, people not involved in military armed rebellion, but simply involved in defending the rights of ordinary people, of indigenous people, of peasants, of the dispossessed, etc. So which aspects of these precisely work of the church for social justice, for a just peace, how is it viewed, let's say, within Colombia today? How do people view the role of the church in this process? Is it accepted that it plays this mediating role, or is it criticized, and rather would the secular politicians rather do not have the church involved in this process? What is going on in Colombia in this respect?
So it's interesting because one of the situation we have is the participation of the Catholic Church in the violence between liberal and conservative parties. And this phenomenon called la violencia during the 40s and the 50s really affects the image and the public the public role of the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was very compromised with one of the political system, one of the parties. In the 60s, the situation is very, very different, because the Catholic Church, especially the hierarchy, are very, very confronted with the situation of many priests criticism the social situation and the poverty and the compromise the hierarchy with the political power. And for this reason, the bishops in this time are related to a situation to establishment power, and there was many criticism with the Vatican Council, especially, and with the meeting in Medellin of the CELAM, because they believe that the social injustice and the social change brings other place of the Catholic Church in the society. So the bishops seems this situation of the 60s especially like a form to dismiss the role of the Catholic Church in the society. For this reason, the bishops was very reactive and very ultra-conservative positions, ultra-conservative positions, and the problem of the rebel priests and the criticism inside of the church, they confront with a disciplinary issue. And the other hand, the situation in many places of the country, for example, the case of Gerardo Valencia, was very interesting because someone who called for a more social justice and attention with the poor and a bishop very charismatic was called for a radio station, a red bishop. So this expressed the situation of partisanship in the 60s, similar to the situation of the violence of the 40s and the 50s. We have this contradiction, and until the 80s, the Catholic Church assumed a position more openly to the modern world, and a position very optimistic of the social change. In fact, after the end of the 70s and the 80s, the Catholic Church assumed a role more important in the peace process, the different peace process, and the compromise with the democracy, human rights, and the work with the different communities. This is basically the situation. The situation is probably a product that a confessional state of the in the end of the 19th century, and the situation of Catholic Church compromise with political power, especially during the decades that conservative party was in the power. And when this finished, or when this situation was changed, the Catholic Church need to make a process to redefine their public role.
Steve, would you like to add something before we open the floor for a discussion? Especially were conservative Catholics, right-wing Catholics involved in the support of the paramilitary, also violent groups? To which extent there was conservative Catholic legitimation of right-wing paramilitary violence?
Yeah. Yeah, I think just a comment on the perception that Colombia was this democracy and didn't fall into the trap of across the region of dictatorships. And Ivan mentioned, in Colombia we did have several decades of appearance of democracy, of just sharing of power between liberal and conservatives. And in large part that was an exclusionary model which led to greater support for armed insurgent groups that were opening and pushing for the 1991, the ideals of the aspirations of the 1991 Constitution. On this question of bishops, many of the bishops that the Pope sort of reprimanded in very subtle but important ways in September 2017, yes, indeed, were considered some of those leaders within the Catholic Church that had closer ties with paramilitary groups and who were very outspoken both within their official roles and in quiet meetings in denouncing the FARC particularly, but also the ELN. And there's a number of reasons for why those bishops, and I won't put any specific examples, but in general terms, many reasons for why some of those bishops were very much against the insurgent movements, and were very supportive of the most repressive of measures, both from the state and then the auxiliary repressive measures that the state, in many ways, the parts of the state endorsed through the paramilitary movements of the 90s and the early 2000s. Some of those reasons come from their family ties, from bishops that came from elite land owners, families in rural parts of Colombia that felt associated with, in one way or another, the somewhat feudal system of governance within the construction of the Colombian state. Their families had benefited from that. Others had themselves or their family members been victims of kidnappings. Certainly kidnappings, the practice of kidnappings radicalized not only Colombian society, but certainly the church. And as I mentioned, the church, many bishops played an important role in trying to free kidnapped victims. But also many of them, because of that, came into direct contact with the amount of human suffering that practice caused. And certainly other bishops had much more ideological, both spiritual as well as political ideological leanings that were more closely affiliated with the paramilitary movements. So you have a variety of reasons in which we have these divisions within the Catholic Bishops' Conference today. I just mentioned really quickly that I mentioned the High Commissioner for Peace, the current High Commissioner for Peace for this government, President Duque. His High Commissioner for Peace is someone who comes out of that conservative, member of the Conservative Party, a member of the much more conservative wings of the Catholic Church, who opposed the peace agreement and was supportive of the no vote. This is Miguel Ceballos, who actually worked here as the Director of Latin American Studies Center at Georgetown for many years, but is still deeply committed to Catholic social teaching. So you do have members of that more conservative parts of the Catholic Church, not only bishops, but who still maintain a commitment to peace, who maintain a commitment to Catholic social values and teachings that are supportive of the pursuit of peace, certainly with a different approach, with a different idea of what that peace means and what implications it would have from their counterparts.
Thank you. We can go a few minutes beyond our time because we started 5 minutes late. So we'll take some time from the coffee break. So we have 15 minutes now for conversation, for questions, please. Deborah, identify yourselves as you ask your questions, please.
Okay. I am Deborah Tonelli from Trento.
Maybe we can pass on microphones.
Hello. I am Deborah Tonelli from Trento, FBK. And thank you for the panelists. It was really interesting to understand better the situation in Latin America. But I'd like to know if the interreligious dialogue is in some way involved in the process of peace building, and also which kind of action the government is doing to improve the peace building among the peoples. So if there is a bottom-up process, and which kind of actions are part of the peace culture?
And in the case of Argentina, there was one of the first organizations for defending of human rights was the Ecumenical Organization for Human Rights. So we're basically conformed from some Methodists and Anglican bishops, some Baptist pastors, and some Catholic bishops. So that was the big umbrella that covered and helped many organizations, mostly because all the churches have international connections. I mean, the globalization of the church in that sense, the other, not just the Catholic Church, but all the churches have a kind of important role there. So that was a big part at the very beginning. Interestingly enough, I think now there is, again, this, and there were some mentions to that, this Catholic Evangelical Association, when there are fighting the idea of the ideology of gender. I mean, there's another ecumenical alliance there. I mean, like people who weren't so pro about ecumenism, now they are marching together against mostly sexual rights. And that's going on, happens a couple of months ago with the abortion law that finally didn't pass in Argentina, but happened in 2010 when we have a national approval of the same-sex marriage. This alliance between evangelicals and Catholics, or sectors of evangelism and Catholicism, is still at work. So there is some kind of ecumenical dialogue there, yes.
Would you like to add something to Colombia?
It's very similar, the situation in Colombia, with the Catholic Church and other confessions, evangelical and groups join together. Is common. The focus of the agenda is basically related to moral issues and pro-life issues and sexual issues. But in practice, there are many initiatives of human rights and peace building in different places, but these initiatives probably don't have the expression or the formal expression of an alliance of values, but in the practice, many groups, many religious and different expressions work in the field. Basically, help to poor people and people who suffer the violence, but in the other level of the discussion, we have this kind of alliance basically related to moral issues.
Just to add to that there's a tremendous amount of ecumenical collaboration at the grassroots level, and in support of peace. You see a lot of Catholic groups reaching out to other Christian churches across Colombia, at the sort of the territorial or grassroots level. A massive amount of mobilization in favor of peace through different networks, in which Christian groups from all faiths are represented. However, the Bishops' Conference, very rarely do you see sort of joint communiques at sort of that national level. It's certainly something that would be welcome in the future, but it doesn't happen as often. There are members of the National Conciliation Commission that are not from the Catholic faith, that are a critical voice in bringing other religious perspectives to Catholic initiatives for peace.
I mean, we must remind ourselves that one of the most radical transformation of Latin American society has been the growth of religious pluralism. From the 60s, it was minorities of Protestants, mainly the old historical churches, Methodist, Presbyterian, but it is the explosion of Pentecostalism, of course, that really has transformed Latin American societies, and fortunately it has happened without religious violence of any kind, mostly. So in this respect, the religious pluralization of Latin America itself, so the loss of Catholic hegemony has happened, if you wish, voluntarily without resistance, and has happened without religious violence. And this in itself is a very positive development of Latin America. Let me identify 4 questions. There was the father over there, second, third. So let's gather these 3 questions. Please identify yourselves, and then I think we'll have time for a final round. So please.
John Hurley. I teach part-time in politics at Catholic University. In view of the upcoming canonization of Oscar Romero, last night at the cathedral we had a fairly good turnout, but most of those in attendance were from Central America. I was just kind of wondering, to what extent does the occurrences in the 80s in Central America, especially El Salvador, and Roscoe Romero play any role at all south of the border, south of El Salvador?
Okay, please, the second question.
My question is,
Identify yourself, please.
my name is Sarkan Gasimov from Azerbaijan. I am a student at Seton Hall University. My question is, in Muslim countries, the governments use the same, even similar sects as groups, and they are gathering them in favor of others. For example, the Sunni groups, they are gathering against the Shia groups. Is there a similar problem in the Christian groups in Argentina or other Latin America?
Right. And please, the third one.
Gerald Schlabach. Following up on your comment, Jose, about Pentecostalism growing without religious violence, I had a question. I should have researched this years ago, and I've never gotten around to it. But in my context with Protestants, somewhat more mainline Protestants in Latin America, I've heard the thesis that the violence, the roots of the violence, especially in Colombia, go back to the violence in La Violencia in the 40s, and a lot of that was directed against Protestants that they see as that they perceived as persecution. I was once in a meeting with I think it was Monsignor Castro, and I asked him this, and he just dismissed it. Said, "No, that wasn't." But is there anything to that?
The number of Protestants at the time in Colombia was so minimal, but anyhow, please. So whoever would like to start, we have 3 questions. I'll say something about the Muslim, but we are going to have a conference on Northern Ireland where the conflict between Protestants and Catholics, of course, center, and we'll have a panel on Islam. So probably we cannot answer your question fully, but
in the process.
Romero, the question, anybody?
Yes. Related to Monsignor Romero, is interesting that in the Pope Francis visit to Colombia the last year, he canonized two bishops, one bishop and a priest who suffered the violence. One of them was a bishop in a region very violent, and the other was a priest who suffered the violence in the period of La Violencia. So I see this situation like a symbol of the other role of the church in the violence. The church like a victim of the violence. In fact, around probably more than 100 bishops and priests and nuns and different actors of the religion of the Catholic Church was assassinated in the period of the armed conflict, around 30 years probably. So this symbol, in my opinion, is very suggestive of the role of the Catholic Church in Colombia. On the other hand, in the 50s and the 60s too, the bishops called the enemies of the Christian civilization, of the Christian country, in the same bag, there are communists and Protestants and Masones, Masons. There are the enemies of the Christian civilization. I don't know if it was a persecution specifically, but the bishops consider that there are the enemies or the threats for the Christian country. This is a fact.
Just add a quick note on the period of the violence in the 1950s. Certainly, if one goes back and looks at some of the Catholic publications from that time, El Catolicismo was one of the most important publication newspapers. You look at some of the titles from that period, and certainly there was a stigmatization of anyone who was not a member of the Conservative Party and therefore very closely tied with the Catholic Church. Even after the end of the violence, you saw resistance to any sort of the reconciliation measures that were trying to initiate some degree of agrarian reform in the early 60s. A real resistance from the sort of the traditional sectors of the Catholic Church. And all of that, from the very small groups, Protestant groups, would be interpreted as a resistance to an opening up of Colombian society to all denominations, but also the important sort of socioeconomic inequalities that to many degrees continue to characterize Colombia today. So we can trace back a lot of the Catholic discourse, sadly, in the 50s, at least what's available in historic records, to a much more radical version of a conservative version of Catholicism. On Monsignor Romero, I actually studied for a semester at Boston College at La UCA, and so I came to Colombia with a great familiarity with Monsignor Romero, and was looking to find movements, groups, Christian-based communities that also had that same orientation, same inspiration from the teaching and the prophetic voice of Monsignor Romero. And one of my sort of questions was, where is that prophetic voice within the Catholic Church in a case where it's not, as I said, the war is not black and white? And I think that prophetic voice comes out in different ways, and whether for certain religious lay and official leadership of the Catholic Church, whether that's inspired or connected to Monsignor Romero, varies to one degree or another. I will say that, within the ELN, ironically, you still have a deep respect for Monsignor Romero, and that's something I think that more liberal, progressive segments of the Catholic Church can build upon to try to bring the ELN to a solution, a negotiated solution to the conflict. But are the Colombian people celebrating the canonization of Monsignor Romero? I would say, in general, a very small group of Colombians within the church are certainly following that very closely and deeply inspired by the Pope's choice to canonize.
Let me start backwards. So the hostility to Protestants, or mostly to evangelicals and Mormons in Latin America, comes from the right and the left, because they were seen as CIA agents. So it was a kind of US infiltration in Latin America trying to tear up the fabric of the continent. So it was opposition from both sides in the 60s and 70s. And again now, because most of the evangelical politicians are right-wing politicians. So the left keep looking to evangelicals with a kind of suspicious view. The violence of divisions within the Christian traditions, it's not a big thing at this point in Latin America. There are some issues. Brazil, for the records of the United Nations, is a very violent country, mostly because of Pentecostals crashing into Afro-American religious groups and destroying the images. The Afro-Brazilian groups, Umbanda, Candomblé, they have this, Macumba, they have this imaginary of different orillas with kind of gods, and the Pentecostals are against that, and they were crashed into violently and crashed the material. There is some kind of hostility, not as violent as that, between majorities and minorities. I think that when Protestants are too small, that they are not a threat, nothing happens. When they grow, the tensions started to grow up, and there is some kind of more political tensions there. And a relationship with the governments, the dictatorial government, with the dictatorships, when they didn't they didn't get the support from the Catholic Church, they look for support from the Pentecostal churches. Like Pinochet was criticized by the Catholic Church, so the Te Deums, this kind of Christian celebration of the National Day, were directed by Pentecostal pastors for 3 or 4 years because Pinochet aligned with them. Rios Montt in Guatemala and his successor, whose name I cannot remember now, they were Pentecostal pastors. And in the case of Rios Montt in Guatemala, I think we can talk about religious persecution because one of the signs of the victims was the Latin American Bible. If you have that Bible, you were dead. And that was it. Usually it has to do with Catholic Quiché people in Guatemala that were, I think Guatemala and El Salvador are the 2 cases of real genocides in Latin America. Romero, as you described, I think in Argentina will be the same. However, the symbolic value of Romero for the Argentinian committed Catholics, as I call them in my book, it will be very, very important. 1977, at that time, 112 Catholic agents have already been killed. When Patricia Derian, the U.S. person for the human rights, went to Argentina and talked to the Nuncio Pio Laghi, she asked him, say, it's a persecution against the church. And the Nuncio said, no. 110 Catholics have been already killed. One Catholic, Father Popieluszko, was killed in Poland, and it was a persecution against the church. And he was canonized as a martyr from the very beginning. On these Catholics in Latin America, there's always the suspicion that they weren't that Catholics. You know, they were kind of Catholic, but Catholic, what you call Catholic, they weren't. So canonizing Romero, I think for many people means, okay, you were a real Catholic. And that message, I think, is very, very important.
Well, on this note, thank you very much to all 3 of you. Let's give them a round of applause.